The helicopter blades hammered the desert sky, chopping the silence into fragments of wind and dust. She sat wedged between two heavily armed SEALs, her medic's pack balanced across her lap like a lifeline. The men barely looked at her. There. Gazes were locked outward, past the open side doors where endless sand rolled beneath them. She was just the corpsman, the one tasked with keeping their blood inside their bodies when bullets and shrapnel decided otherwise. To them, she wasn't part of the team, at least not yet. When the Black Hawk touched down, the heat rushed up to greet them. She slid out behind the line of operators, boots crunching on gravel. Her uniform bore no distinguishing marks beyond the red cross stitched to her shoulder patch. Her hands, calloused and sure, carried her gear as though it weighed nothing. Still, her role was defined. Patch wounds, stabilize, evacuate. Nothing more. The compound they would call home for the coming months sat on the edge of nowhere, a squat fortress of concrete and barbed wire. Dust swirled in the air like restless spirits. The men moved with casual confidence, weapons cradled as naturally as extensions of their arms. She followed, head lowered, her pace steady. Inside the barracks, introductions were brief. SEALs weren't known for long speeches. Doc, they called her, some with polite nods, some with a hint of skepticism. She didn't mind. She had been in uniform long enough to know trust wasn't earned through greetings. It was earned in sweat, in silence, and sometimes in blood. Her bunk was small, tucked into the far corner. She unpacked slowly, methodically. Gauze, scalpels, forkits, morphine injectors. She lined them up on the shelf, like soldiers standing. At attention. These were her weapons, and she knew them better than any rifle. That evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, she found herself at the shooting range. The SEALs practiced in tight groups, their laughter sharp and competitive, rifles barking in unison. She stayed off to the side, watching quietly, studying the rhythm of their movements. Then, almost on a whim, she approached one of the spare rifles left resting against a sandbag wall. "Hey, Doc," one of the men called, his grin half amusement, half challenge. "That's not your toy." She didn't answer. She simply lifted the weapon, feeling its weight settle into her shoulder. The steel was heavier than the medical instruments she carried, yet there was a familiarity to it, a steadiness that mirrored the calm she relied on in the operating tent. She took her time with the first shot. Breath in, breath out. Squeeze. The rifle cracked, the recoil nudging against her body, and the target at 300 meters sprouted a hole dead center. A few heads turned. She fired again. Another hole, nearly, touching the first. By the third shot, the laughter had died down. A group of hardened operators, men who prided themselves on marksmanship, exchanged glances. Their smirks faded into nods, subtle but unmistakable. "Not bad for a doc," one muttered. She lowered the rifle, her expression unreadable. She wasn't looking for praise. She wasn't even trying to impress them. But she had felt something stir inside her, a quiet recognition of skill, something she hadn't shown in years, something she hadn't been asked to reveal. That night, in the dim barracks, the men swapped stories. Combat tales, jokes too crude to repeat, memories of lost brothers. She listened, silent, absorbing every detail. They hardly noticed her, and she preferred it that way. But when one of them asked, "Doc, you ever think of doing more than patching holes?" she didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the silence hang, her eyes fixed on the floor. Then softly, with the calm tone she always carried, she said, "Saving lives is enough." They let it drop. But they noticed the way her gaze didn't waver, the way she said it, like a promise. Days turned into weeks. Missions came and went, and each time she was there when the team returned, sometimes battered, sometimes bleeding. She worked with quiet efficiency, stitching wounds, pushing IVs, stopping blood with her bare hands when she had to. She didn't flinch at screams, didn't hesitate when time meant life or death. The SEALs began to trust her in the only way that mattered. They stopped questioning whether she could handle it. Yet every so often, someone caught her back at the range. Alone. This time, no audience, just her and the targets. The rifle spoke in clean, controlled bursts. The grouping of her shots was too precise to be luck. But when they asked why she practiced, she simply shrugged. "Keeps me calm," she'd say. And that was the end of it. But deep down, they knew. She wasn't just their medic. She was something else, waiting for a moment none of them could predict. The morning heat came early in Afghanistan. By sunrise, the compound was already alive with motion men pulling on body armor, checking gear, oiling weapons. Dust clung to everything, grinding into their clothes, their skin, even their teeth. She moved through it all like a shadow, medical bag over her shoulder, boots crunching on the gravel paths between the barracks and the motor pool. To the SEALs, she was still just Doc. Not unwelcome, but not one of them either. Trust wasn't given here. It was earned, often painfully, and only through proof. Her first test wasn't on the battlefield. It came during a training run. The team jogged out into the desert, weapons slung across their chests, sweat pouring down their faces as the sun rose higher. She ran with them, pack strapped to her back, its weight punishing with each step. Some had assumed she wouldn't last 5 miles. By mile 10, their assumptions started to crack. "Doc, you keeping up back there?" One of the men shouted over his shoulder. "Better than you," she answered, voice even, steps steady. The men laughed, but it wasn't the dismissive kind. They respected grit, and she had it. By the time they circled back to the compound, she was still on pace, breathing hard but refusing to slow. She didn't collapse like some recruits did. She simply adjusted the strap on her pack and walked calmly to refill her canteen. That was the first time they began to look at her differently. The next test came at the range. Training days blurred together. Endless hours of shooting, reaching drills, fast roping, clearing rooms. She wasn't required to join most of it, but she did anyway. She stood with them, listening, watching, asking no favors. And when they handed her a weapon half in jest, half in curiosity, she accepted it without hesitation. They expected her to miss. She didn't. Her grouping was tight, unnervingly so. Her breathing was slow, measured, every shot a mirror of the last. When she laid the rifle down, the silence from the team said more than words could. A few muttered. Curses, some headshakes. One SEAL grinned, shaking his head. "Hell, Doc," he said. "You sure you're not in the wrong job?" She gave no answer, only the faintest flicker of a smile. Day by day, they tested her. Not formally, but in ways men test those they aren't sure of. They teased, pushed, prodded. They made her haul gear, double-check med kits, sit through briefings that weren't meant for her. She endured it all, without complaint. If they expected her to break, she didn't. If they expected her to boast, she stayed silent. She seemed to understand the unspoken rules. In this world, talk was cheap. Only action mattered. Her calmness unnerved them. Under pressure, when tempers flared, she stayed level. In chaos, she was collected. When one man sprained an ankle on patrol, she treated it so quickly and cleanly that he was back on his feet before he had time to curse. When another cut his hand deep on broken metal, she stitched it with a precision that left the scar barely visible. "Doc's got surgeon's hands," one of them muttered, flexing his bandaged fingers. "Doc's got ice water in her veins," another corrected. They began to believe it. At the turning point came one scorching afternoon during A leave fire drill. The team was moving through a mock village, kicking in doors, firing blanks, calling targets. She followed at the rear, rifle slung, medical bag bouncing against her hip. The drill wasn't hers to join until one of the men tripped mid-run, going down hard. The others surged past, focused on their objective, but she dropped instantly. To his side. His leg was twisted at an ugly angle, pain written across his face. She didn't panic. She didn't even flinch. She snapped her bag open, wrapped the leg in a splint with movement so fast it was like muscle memory. The man groaned, sweat pouring, but when she helped him up, he was hobbling forward within minutes. The instructors had seen it. The team had seen it. She wasn't just a medic. She was a problem solver, someone who didn't freeze, didn't wait, didn't hesitate. Later that evening, while they sat in the mess hall, the SEAL with the splinted leg raised his tin mug toward her. "To Doc," he said. "She doesn't quit." The others joined in, some with smirks, some with genuine respect. She didn't raise her mug in return. She just nodded slightly, eyes calm, as though the acknowledgement didn't matter to her. But deep inside, she felt the shift. The wall between them was beginning to crack. She still wasn't one of them, not fully. But the line had blurred. They no longer saw just the red cross on her shoulder. They saw the steel beneath it. One night, weeks later, she sat at the edge of the range long after drills were done. The desert air was cool, the stars bright against the black sky. She had a rifle across her knees, cleaning it with practiced motions. She thought she was alone until a shadow moved beside her. It was their team leader, a man whose eyes had seen too many wars. He crouched next to her, watching silently for a moment. "You shoot better than half my men," he said finally. She looked up at him, but didn't respond. "You ever think about switching roles?" he asked. "Sniper school, maybe?" Her hands paused on the weapon, but only for a second. Then she went back to cleaning. "My job is to keep people alive," she said quietly. The leader studied her face, searching for something, then nodded. He didn't push it. He simply stood, walked away, and left her to the stars. But even as she repeated the words to herself, she couldn't ignore what the rifle felt like in her hands. She couldn't ignore the way her breathing slowed, her mind sharpened, her world narrowed to the calm center of a crosshair. The SEALs were beginning to trust her. But trust was just the beginning. What they didn't know, what even she didn't fully admit yet, was that trust would one day turn into reliance. And reliance, in war, could mean survival. The desert night was alive with silence. A silence that wasn't peaceful, but heavy, stretched thin like a wire ready to snap. Stars spread across the black sky in a glittering sprawl, but down on the ground, inside the armored vehicles, there was no beauty, only nerves sharpened to the edge. She sat wedged in the back of the MRAP, rifle slung, medic bag strapped across her chest. The men around her checked gear with mechanical precision. Magazines loaded, optics wiped clean, radios adjusted. They moved like machines, but she could feel their pulse in the air, steady, deliberate, waiting. It was supposed to be a routine op. The intel was clean. A target compound where insurgents were rumored to be stockpiling weapons. In and out, fast and surgical. Nothing unusual for this team. She'd heard the plan in the briefing and felt the weight of every word. "Quick," the lieutenant had said. "No mess, no delays. Secure, clear, and exfil before the sun comes." Up, routine. She almost believed it. The NEORA-P jolted as it rolled over a ridge, then slowed. Dust swirled in through the cracks, the taste of grit sticking to her tongue. When the vehicle stopped, the ramp dropped, and the team spilled out into the night like shadows dissolving into deeper shadow. She followed, boots hitting sand, her heartbeat steady but alert. The village lay ahead, broken mud brick walls, half-collapsed roofs, alleyways that looked more like scars than streets. It had been abandoned for years, but in war, nothing stayed empty for long. The air smelled of dust and oil, heavy and stale. They moved in silence, weapons raised, boots soft against the dirt. She kept to the rear, scanning both the ground and the rooftops, her senses tuned to every sound. Her job wasn't to fight, it was to pick up the pieces when fighting ended. But her instincts told her tonight wouldn't be routine. The first house was clear, the second too. Just shadows, rats, and broken furniture. The seals worked fast, each motion practiced. Breach, sweep, signal clear. She trailed behind, her eyes always searching for the unexpected. And then, the unexpected arrived. The crack of gunfire split the night. Not one shot, but dozens, pouring. From rooftops and alleyways. Muzzle flashes lit the dark like lightning. The world exploded around them. Contact left. Voices shouted over the roar. Bullets tore into walls, shattering brick, spraying dust. The team dove for cover, rifles snapping up, answering fire with fire. The air filled with the metallic stench of gunpowder. The buzz of rounds slicing too close. She didn't think. She moved. 2 men were down. One hit the ground screaming, clutching his thigh, blood spurting between his fingers. The other crumpled silently, motionless, chest rising shallowly. She sprinted low, sliding into cover beside them, bag already open, gloves yanked on in one. Motion. Stay with me, she hissed, pressing gauze hard against the bleeding thigh. The man groaned, teeth clenched, but she barely heard. Her world had narrowed to wounds, blood, and seconds slipping away. Overhead, gunfire hammered. Dirt sprayed against her helmet as rounds smacked into the wall inches above. She ducked lower, kept pressure steady, then reached for a tourniquet. "Doc," one of the SEALs roared from behind a broken wall. "Stay down." She ignored him. She looped the tourniquet, tightened it until the bleeding slowed, then leaned over the second man. His chest wound bubbled with every shallow breath. A sucking wound. Her hands moved fast. Seal, tape, stabilize. Every motion drilled into her, through endless hours of training. But then she heard it, a heavy clunk of metal against stone. She looked up just in time to see a man on a rooftop, RPG slung over his shoulder, taking aim. Her blood ran cold. If he fired, the blast would end them all. Her eyes darted to the ground beside her, where a fallen SEAL's sniper rifle lay. In the dust, its scope glinting faintly in the moonlight. Time seemed to freeze. Her patient still bled beneath her hands. Her team fired desperately, pinned down. And yet, in that instant, she knew, saving the men at her feet meant nothing if the rest of the team was blown apart in the next 3 seconds. Her hands hesitated only once. Then she set down the gauze, fingers curling around cold steel. She lifted the rifle, the weight grounding her like an anchor. The stock pressed against her cheek, her breathing slowed, and the chaos of the firefight lured into a single point, the crosshairs lined on the insurgent's chest. She exhaled, squeezed. The rifle cracked. The man dropped, the RPG slipping from his grip, clattering harmlessly onto the rooftop. She blinked once, hard, then shifted back to her patients. Hands red, gloves slick. Pressure. Seal. Breathe. She was a medic again. But the battlefield didn't care what she was. More enemies surged, more muzzle flashes sparking from windows. And alleys. Another figure rose with a rifle. She glanced at the scope again. She knew she had no choice. Back to the rifle. One shot. Down. Back to the wounded. Compress. Stabilize. The rhythm came without thought. Life and death, hand to trigger, hand to bandage. She was two people at once. And for the first time, the seals around her realized it. "Docks on the glass," someone shouted between bursts of gunfire. "She's covering us, keep moving." They pressed forward, emboldened, firing harder, tighter. Every time, an enemy raised his weapon, her rifle cracked, sharp and clean. Every time one of her men gasped in pain, her hands returned to them, steady, certain. Minutes stretched like hours. The firefight raged, bullets shredding the air, dust choking every breath. But she never faltered. She became the heartbeat of the fight-saver, killer, guardian. When the last of the gunfire faded and silence fell, heavy over the ruins, she lowered the rifle with trembling arms. Around her, the SEALs checked themselves, checked each other. 2 men were alive who might not have been. 3 more stood, because her shots had dropped threats before they could. She didn't say a word. She just sat back against the wall, gloves drenched, rifle still warm, heart thundering but face calm. The men stared at her, some in disbelief, some in awe. One of them muttered, almost to himself, "Medic and sniper." In the same damn breath, she said nothing. She picked up her bag again, pressed new gauze into her patient's wound, and whispered softly, "You're gonna make it." The night swallowed the words, but the SEALs heard them all the same. And in that silence, trust turned into something stronger, something unshakable. The battlefield had a smell of burnt powder, sweat, blood, and dust mingling into something metallic and bitter that clung to the back of the throat. She crouched in the broken corner of the compound, one knee pressed into the dirt, her gloves slick with blood. The night pulsed with chaos, gunfire in bursts, shouts fractured by adrenaline, the buzz of rounds tearing the air overhead. Beside her, 2 men bled into the sand. She had already saved one from bleeding out with a tourniquet, but the second still gasped shallowly, chest wound bubbling with every breath. Her fingers moved fast, sealing it, securing tape, whispering calm words meant more for rhythm than comfort. And then her eyes flicked left. The sniper rifle lay there long, dark, unforgiving, dropped by a fallen SEAL minutes before. Its scope glinted in the fractured moonlight, as though beckoning. She had touched plenty of rifles, fired them on the range, but this one felt different. It wasn't training. This wasn't practice. This was war, and picking it up meant stepping into a role she had no right to claim. She pressed harder on the wound, watching the man's chest rise and fall. His life still hung in her hands. That was her mission, keep them alive. But then another shout rang out. RPG. Roof. Her head snapped up. Another enemy, barely visible through dust and smoke, hoisted a launcher onto his shoulder. If he fired, the blast would rip through the entire compound. Her patients, her team, everyone would be gone. Her hands froze for half a second, torn, between the man at her feet and the man about to fire. It was a cruel choice. Save one life here, or save all of them there. Her chest tightened. For an instant, doubt clawed at her. She wasn't a sniper, wasn't trained for this. But her breathing slowed, just as it did in the range. Calm in chaos. She remembered the weight of every shot she'd ever taken, the stillness before the trigger broke. And suddenly, the decision wasn't a choice at all. She let go of the gauze. Her fingers wrapped around cold steel. The rifle felt heavier than anything she'd ever carried, but also natural, like it had been waiting for her all along. She pulled it close, pressed the stock into her shoulder, cheek against the worn padding. The world narrowed instantly, tunnel vision collapsing until there was nothing but the circle of the scope. Her heartbeat steadied. The chaos faded. All she saw was the man with the RPG, his stance, his finger curling toward the trigger. Exhale. Squeeze. The crack tore through the night. The insurgent dropped, the launcher clattering harmlessly to the rooftop. For half a second, there was silence in her head. No shouts, no gunfire, no heartbeat. Just the echo of the shot. She blinked hard and lowered her eye from the scope. Her patients were still bleeding. She was still a medic. She shoved the rifle aside, gloves pressing back onto the wound, re-securing the tape, whispering, "Stay with me." But the world didn't pause. Another muzzle flash sparked from the window of a ruined house. Another man rising, rifle raised. Her gaze darted to the scope again. Her hands were torn between two worlds. Bandage in one, trigger in the other. This time, there was no hesitation. She shifted back to the rifle, steady, deliberate. Another shot cracked, and the figure in the window collapsed. Back to her patience. Pressure, seal, stabilize. Back to the rifle. Crosshairs, breath, squeeze. It became a rhythm, an impossible, unthinkable rhythm. She was saving and killing in the same breaths, hands flowing from mercy to violence and back again. The SEALs noticed. At first, confusion, then disbelief, then something sharper, respect. Docs on the scope. One of them shouted over the gunfire, "Covering us, move." They surged forward, emboldened, trusting her eyes and her trigger as much as her medical hands. Every time an enemy leaned out to fire, her rifle cracked. Every time one of her men gasped in pain, her hands returned, relentless, focused. But inside, she felt the fracture. She had always been the healer, the one who swore to keep life intact, not take it. Every shot pressed against that vow, against the part of her that believed in saving everyone. And yet, every time she fired, she knew it wasn't about breaking that promise. It was about protecting it. Her bullets didn't betray her oath. They defended it. She wasn't just a medic anymore. She wasn't just a sniper either. She was both, and the battlefield demanded nothing less. The firefight dragged on, minutes stretching into something timeless. Sweat drenched her, dust coated. Her tongue, her shoulder throbbed with every recoil. But she didn't falter. Her mind split in two, each side working in perfect synchrony. Calm sniper, relentless medic. At one point, while tying off another wound, one SEAL leaned close, voice hoarse, eyes wide. "You're not just saving us," he whispered. "You're keeping us alive every way there is." She didn't respond. She just adjusted the bandage, pressed harder, then picked the rifle back up and dropped another threat before he could fire. And slowly, the chaos began to thin. Enemy fire slackened, the crack of rifles grew less frequent, and silence crept back into the ruins. She lowered the scope, scanning, waiting, until there was nothing left but echoes and the smell of smoke. Her gloves were soaked in red. The rifle's barrel was warm against her arm. Around her, men breathed who should have been dead, and threats lay still who would have ended them. She sat back hard against the wall, chest heaving, sweat dripping into her eyes. The rifle lay across her knees, heavy and quiet now. She stared at it for a long moment, then at her blood-stained hands. Healer, killer, both. She thought she might break under the weight of that realization. But instead, she felt steady. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just one thing. She was everything her team needed, in the exact second they needed it. And though she said nothing, though she looked back down at her patient and whispered, "Again, stay with me," the SEALs had already decided. They would never forget what they'd seen her do. Not tonight. Not ever. The sound of the shot lingered longer than it should have, echoing in her head even after the target fell. She had pulled the trigger before, but on the range, on still targets that didn't breathe, didn't scream, didn't bleed. This was different. The insurgent had been alive one heartbeat, planning to take her brothers with him, and the next? Gone. She hadn't celebrated. She hadn't flinched. But as she lowered the scope, her heart slammed in her chest. Not from fear, from the weight of what she had just done. The man at her feet groaned, dragging her back into her true role. His chest wound bubbled faintly under the bandage. She pressed hard, leaned close, and whispered, "Stay with me. You're not done yet." Her voice was calm, steady, the same tone she always used in trauma bays, a voice meant to anchor men clinging to life. But the world refused to let her stay in that role. "Rooftop, right side," one of the SEALs barked. She looked up instinctively, eyes catching movement in. The moonlight, another enemy, this one with an old AK, rifle barrel lowering toward the team's flank. Her pulse slowed. Without hesitation, she let go of the bandage for a single breath, slid the rifle into her shoulder, and sighted in. Crosshairs, breath, squeeze. The enemy dropped like a marionette with cut strings. She didn't think. She didn't allow herself the luxury. She rolled back to her patient, fingers working, gauze shifting, blood soaking through. Her gloves were sticky, slick, but she moved as though she had 4 hands. Bang. Enemy down. Press. Seal. Breathe. Bang. Another down. Clamp. Tape. Tourniquet. The rhythm consumed her. At first, it was chaos. Her mind tugged in 2 directions. Medic and sniper, healer and killer. But as minutes dragged on, it became something else. A rhythm she could almost predict. Like 2 halves of herself were finally syncing, not fighting each other. She was both, seamlessly. The SEALs noticed. Pinned down in cover, one of them peeked over the wall to return fire, only to see the man in his sights already falling. Courtesy of her shot. He glanced back, eyes wide, catching sight of the medic in the dust, rifle pressed to her shoulder like she'd been born with it there. "Doc's covering," he shouted to the others. That single acknowledgement spread. Like fire. Suddenly, they trusted her scope the way they trusted her hands. When they surged forward to breach the next building, they didn't shout at her to stay back. They didn't drag her behind the line. They moved with the confidence of men who knew she was their shield, even if she wasn't standing shoulder to shoulder with them. She felt the shift too. The rifle no longer seemed foreign. It was an extension of the calm she already lived in. The same control she used to stitch wounds steady under pressure translated to the trigger, to her breathing, to her aim. Saving and taking weren't opposites anymore. They were 2 sides of the same coin, but the weight of that first kill lingered. Between shots, between compressions, she caught glimpses of the man's face in her mind. Not clear, just fragments. The way he'd held the RPG, the way he'd stood seconds before she dropped him. She reminded herself that he would have killed them all, that he left her no choice. But justification didn't make the image fade. Another shout ripped her out of thought. "Frag out!" She ducked instinctively, curling over her patient as an explosion rattled the compound, showering dust and stone. Her ears rang, her shoulder burned from debris, but she didn't stop working. She shifted, taped, tightened. Then, rifle again scope, breath, squeeze. The team leader's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. "Doc, you've got Overwatch. Don't miss." He hadn't needed to say it. She wouldn't miss. She felt something stir in her chest at those words. Overwatch. That wasn't a medic's job. That was a sniper's duty. Yet here she was, doing both. And the men, the toughest, most elite warriors she'd ever known, were depending on her for both. The firefight stretched on, every second demanding more from her. Sweat trickled into her eyes. Her muscles ached from the recoil. Her gloves tore and clung to her skin, but she never faltered. Then came the hardest moment. She was pressing a chest wound closed, her patient fading fast. His lips were pale, breaths shallow. She had just prepped a needle for decompression when movement caught her eye, two insurgents flanking the compound, rifles raised. If she stayed, her patient might live. If she didn't fire, the whole team might die. Her hands trembled only once before she made the choice. She grabbed the rifle, snapped to the scope, and dropped them both with two sharp cracks. When she rolled back, her patient was still there, still breathing. She jammed the needle in, relieving pressure. His chest rose fuller. He coughed, lived. In that moment, she understood. The rifle wasn't a betrayal of her oath. It was an extension of it. The chaos finally thinned. The insurgents broke, retreating into the night. A gunfire faded, leaving only smoke, groans, and the echo of ringing ears. The SEALs regrouped, pulling security, checking each other. She sat back against the wall, rifle across her lap, gloves red to the wrists. Her body shook, but her face stayed calm, expression unreadable. She watched her patient's chest rise steady, then looked at the bodies lying farther out in the dust. 2 rolls, 1 person. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. But the SEALs were. One of them, gritting through the dust, crouched beside her. "Doc," he said, voice rough, "you just saved us twice. Don't think we'll forget that first shot?" She didn't answer. She just tightened the tourniquet on her patient's leg, checked his pulse, and whispered, "Stay with me." But inside, she knew the truth. That first shot had changed everything, not just for her, but for the team. From that moment on, she wasn't only their medic. She was their sniper. 2. The firefight refused to end. Minutes dragged into something longer, time twisting under the weight of adrenaline and exhaustion. Each second bled into the next gunfire. Dust, shouting, pain, silence, and more gunfire. To her, the world had become 2 rhythms beating at once. The fragile pulse of the men she tried to keep alive, and the thunderous crack of the rifle in her hands. She moved between them like a pendulum, swinging from healer to killer and back again. One man was slipping fast. A round had torn through his thigh, shredding the artery. Blood pooled in the dirt, hot against her knees as she worked. She clamped. Hard, her gloves crimson, and felt the faint flutter of his pulse. Weak, fading. Then, a voice rang out over the chaos. "Rooftop, left side." She didn't look up. Her patient was seconds from bleeding out. But when the shadow moved across the roofline, she knew. If she ignored it, her patient wouldn't matter anyway. None of them would. Her hands froze on the gauze. Then she shifted. One fluid motion, practiced though never trained tourniquet. Cinched tight, rifle into her shoulder, scope locking on the rooftop. The insurgent barely had time to lean forward before her shot punched him back into the dark. The SEAL covering her flank barked a laugh, rough and disbelieving. "Doc's got better eyes than half of us." She didn't laugh. She went right. Back to the man in the dirt, pressing, clamping, whispering steady words as though nothing had interrupted her. But inside, she felt that the rhythm wasn't 2 separate beats anymore. It was one. Her oath to preserve life didn't crumble when she pulled the trigger. It was sharpened, refined, forced into its truest form. She wasn't betraying it. She was honoring it. The battle pressed harder. Ammunition ran low. The SEALs exchanged magazines with clip deficiency, their movements sharp but slowing. Sweat dripped into their eyes. Their shouts grew hoarse. They were being tested, not just in skill, but in endurance. And she, the medic who was never supposed to fire a weapon, was becoming the fulcrum. Cover the breach. The team leader roared. She shifted to the corner, rifle angled through a broken wall. Figures darted between shadows, trying to flank. Each time she fired, clean, precise, surgical. The way she stitched wounds, she stitched their defense together tight, unbroken, deliberate. Between shots, she darted back to her patients, checked vitals, replaced bandages, injected morphine. Every man she touched stabilized just enough to hold on. None of them slipped away, not on her watch. One SEAL, crouched beside her as she reloaded, shook his head in disbelief. "Doc, you're not just keeping us alive, you're keeping us in the fight." She didn't answer. Her focus never wavered. Rifle, bandage, rifle, bandage. The enemy pressure finally peaked. A squad of insurgents charged, screaming, firing wildly as they rushed across open ground. For a heartbeat, it felt like the tide would break the compound. Then she rose from cover, rifle steady, and cut them down one by one. Each shot was a scalpel, carving the attack apart before it could reach them. Her calm was unshakable, her aim absolute. The SEALs shouted encouragement, their fire doubling in force, momentum shifting back into their hands. This was the turning point. The team, battered and bloodied, realized they weren't just holding out, they were winning. Not because of sheer numbers, not because of brute force, but because their medic had become their sniper, their anchor, their shield. "Push forward," the leader bellowed. The SEALs surged, clearing the last building with ruthless efficiency. She remained behind, kneeling in the dirt, hands pressed to a man's chest wound, while a rifle leaned against her shoulder, still warm. She could hear the fight move away from her, echoes fading into silence. Then, finally, stillness. The compound was theirs. For the first time in what felt like hours, no shots rang out. The air was heavy with smoke, the bitter tongue of cordite, the iron sting of blood. Men groaned softly, catching their breath, checking wounds. She sat back hard against the wall, her gloves soaked, her arms trembling. Around her, 3 men lay, breathing alive only because she had been there, because her hands hadn't stopped, because her rifle had spoken when it needed to. The SEALs gathered slowly, one by one, checking in, counting heads. When they realized everyone was still breathing, a ripple of disbelief passed through them. They should have lost more. By the math of war, at least 2 should have died, but none had. The team leader approached, helmet tucked under his arm, his face drawn but resolute. He crouched in front of her, eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the battlefield noise faded, and it was only the 2 of them. "You saved more than their lives tonight," he said, voice low but firm. "You saved all of us." She didn't respond. She looked down at her hands, one still gripping gauze, the other resting on the rifle across her knees. Blood and steel. Life and death. Both hers now. The men didn't need her words. They had seen enough. Later, as they prepared to exfil, whispers ran through the group. Not jokes, not teasing, but something rare respect spoken aloud. Doc's got ice in her veins. She's the reason we're walking out. She's not just our medic anymore. She heard them, but she didn't react. She packed her bag, checked her patience, and stood ready to move. She was exhausted, body screaming for rest, but her mind was clear. Tonight, she had shifted in seconds from one role to another, from healer to sniper, and back again. And in doing so, she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The turning point wasn't just the battle. It was her. The flight back was quiet. The SEALs sat in the dim red glow of the helicopter, their bodies sagging with exhaustion, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. Every man carried scars from the night scratches, bruises, burns, holes patched by field dressings, but they were all breathing. That fact hung in the air, heavier than any silence. She sat wedged between two of the wounded, monitoring vitals, hands still stained crimson, even though she had scrubbed them raw with water before. Boarding. Her rifle rested across her lap, its barrel blackened, its stock scarred from the fight. Normally, the bird back from an op buzzed with banter-dark jokes, half-laughs, the shared relief of survival. Tonight, none of that came. Instead, the men kept stealing glances at her, as if unsure what to make of her anymore. When the helicopter touched down at base, the weight lifted only slightly. Medics rushed forward to take the wounded, and she followed, reporting vitals, summarizing injuries with the clipped precision drilled into her. But even as the other medics wheeled the stretchers inside, the SEALs didn't disperse. They waited. For her, the team leader finally broke the silence. Debrief. 10 minutes. She nodded, even though her body ached for sleep. The debriefing room was small, harshly lit, the kind of place where every mission's chaos was stripped down to facts. Normally, she'd sit quietly in the corner while the operators spoke. But tonight, when the leader started, all eyes slid toward her. Mission compromised early, he said. Heavy resistance. Multiple casualties. He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. But all lives saved. Enemy neutralized. Compound secure. Then his gaze sharpened, landing on her. Because of Doc, a ripple moved through the room. Not surprise. No one could deny what they'd witnessed, but something heavier. Agreement. Acknowledgement. He continued, voice steady. She shifted roles in seconds. Treated casualties under fire, then dropped hostiles before they could take us out. I've never seen anything like it. For the first time since the firefight ended, she felt heat rise in her chest. Not pride something. More complicated. A knot of relief, guilt, and something that felt dangerously close to belonging. The team leader looked around the room. Let it be clear. What happened out there doesn't fade when the dust settles. We'll remember it forever. Silence followed, deep and unbroken. Then one SEAL, the one she'd patched in the dirt while firing over his shoulder, leaned forward. His voice was hoarse but certain. She's one of us. No one argued. The recognition wasn't a medal, not yet. It wasn't a promotion or a line in a report. It was heavier than that. It was trust. It was respect. It was the unspoken admission that she had crossed into a place very few ever reached. Not just a medic, not just support, but a warrior standing shoulder to shoulder with them. After the debrief, the men didn't scatter as usual. They lingered. A strange quiet in their movements, as though reluctant to leave. She stood, weary, gathering her gear. When she turned to leave, one of them caught her shoulder. Doc, she glanced back. You're not just patching holes anymore. You're keeping us alive in every way that counts. Don't ever doubt. That, she gave a small nod. Words didn't come easy. They never did. The following days blurred into routine decontamination, reports, gear checks. But the way the team treated her was different now. Small things at first. A nod that lingered longer. A seat saved without asking. Ammunition slid her way without a word. And then, during a training run, it became undeniable. She was patching. A simulated casualty when the team leader barked. Sniper overwatch, 20 meters out. The men moved without hesitation, and so did she. Rifle up, scope locked, she simulated shots with the same precision she had in the field. When the exercise ended, the leader didn't critique her role. He didn't separate medic from shooter. He simply said, "That's how it's done." Recognition. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't medals. It was something deeper, etched into the fabric of trust that bound them. Still, at night, when the base quieted and she finally had time to think, the weight pressed down. She remembered faces. The insurgent she had dropped with her first shot. the ones who fell in the charge. The way her patient's pulse had faded beneath her hands until she fired, then returned once she saved him. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what her oath meant now. Was she still the medic who promised to preserve life? Or had she become something else, something forged by necessity, tempered by blood? Her thoughts twisted in circles until the knock came at her door. It was the team leader. He didn't step inside, just leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "You're not sleeping," he said. She didn't deny it. He nodded slightly. "First kill's always heavy. So is the second. And the 10th? Don't let anyone tell you different." She waited. "But what you did out there?" His voice softened, rare for him. "That wasn't just pulling a trigger. That was protecting your brothers. That was medicine, in its own way. Just a different tool." The words sank deep, settling the storm inside her for the first time. She wasn't betraying her oath. She was expanding it. When he left, she sat for a long while in silence, the sounds of the base humming around her. She thought about the men who had called her one of them, about the respect that had shifted the very air between them, about the truth she had started to accept. Recognition wasn't about applause. It wasn't about medals. It was about being remembered, not for the life you lived, but for the lives you saved. And she knew now she would be remembered forever. The desert never really left her. Years later, she could still smell the acrid sting of dust and smoke if she closed her eyes. She could still feel the vibration of rotor blades in her chest, the sharp recoil of her rifle, the sticky warmth of blood beneath her hands. Those things didn't fade. They etched themselves into the marrow, into the very rhythm of her heartbeat. But so did the voices. The ones that whispered in the debriefing room, "She's one of us." The one that spoke in the chaos of the firefight, "Doc, don't stop. I need you." And above all, the steady voice of her team leader, "You didn't betray your oath. You just found another way to honor it." She carried those voices longer than she carried her rifle. When her deployment ended, and the transport plane ferried her back across oceans, she knew she wasn't the same woman who had left. At the gates of the base, civilians cheered, waving flags, their smiles bright and endless. She smiled back, but her eyes searched the crowd and found no familiar faces. Her family wouldn't understand. How could they? She had gone away a medic and returned something different. On base, recognition came in quiet waves. Official commendations, words read off in ceremonies, medals pinned to her chest. She stood at attention, uniform pressed sharp, and listened as commanders praised her actions in measured tones. Exceptional courage under fire, exemplary dual-role performance, unprecedented adaptability. But the words that mattered most didn't come from generals or brass. They came in quiet nods from men who had stood beside her in the dust. They came in letters slipped under her door, scrawled in rough handwriting from those who could not find the words face to face. They came in a single line, carved into the inside of her rifle case by one of her teammates before he left for another tour. "Doc saved us all." That was her legacy. Not the medals, not the reports. The men who walked out alive, breathing because she had refused to choose between saving lives and ending threats. Still, legacy wasn't easy to carry. Nights were the hardest. Dreams blurred between triage and scope, between blood pumping out and blood spraying across the sand. Sometimes she woke gasping, hands clenched as if still pressing a wound. Other times she woke calm, as though the rifle stock was still against her shoulder. When sleep refused her, she walked the base at night. That was where she noticed the new medics watching her. Young, eager, still green around the edges. They looked at her like a story already told, like a name whispered in halls before they ever met her. At first, she resisted. She wasn't a teacher. She wasn't a legend. She was just someone who had been forced to make choices no textbook could prepare her for. But then she saw the fear in their eyes before their first field exercises, and she remembered her own. She remembered being terrified the first time blood pumped hot through her gloves. So she began to speak, not grand speeches, just quiet lessons. How to hold pressure without panic. How to breathe steady when hands shook. How to read the battlefield like a pulse, to sense when danger was near, even if you couldn't see it. And one night, after a long pause, she added the lesson no manual would ever teach. Sometimes saving lives means picking up a rifle. The room fell silent. They stared at her, unsure. But she saw it click, the understanding that war had no clean lines, no roles that stayed neat in their boxes. And maybe, just maybe, she eased their fear for the day when they'd be forced to learn the same. Her story began to ripple outward. At first, just among medics, then across the SEAL community. Soon, she wasn't just Doc. She was the medic who became a sniper in seconds. The one who refused to choose. The one the SEALs said they'd remember forever. Years passed. She rotated out, moved into stateside training roles, mentored fresh recruits. She thought distance would dull the memories, but the opposite happened. The further she got from the battlefield, the sharper the images became. Not just of the chaos, but of the still moments, the pulse fluttering back beneath her fingers after she fired. Nods from teammates, the silence after the fight ended. She never told her family the full truth. Some things weren't meant for living rooms or dinner tables. But she told her story to those who needed it, the medics stepping into combat zones, the young soldiers who believed their job was only to heal or only to fight. She told it to show them that sometimes, when everything collapses, you can be both. And in telling it, she understood something she hadn't before. Her legacy wasn't about her at all. It was about them. The lives she touched, the ones who walked away, the ones who carried her lessons forward. It was about the ripple, the way one night in the desert would echo for years in the hands and hearts of others. The SEALs kept their promise. Whenever they gathered, when stories flowed over beers or around campfires, her name came up. They told the tale not like a myth, but like a memory burned too deep to fade. She saved us. She dropped them before they could drop us. She'll be remembered forever. And she was. Not as a soldier who killed, not as a medic who healed, but as both. As proof that war demanded more than simple categories, and that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't choosing one path, but walking both at once. In the end, that was her legacy. Not the rifle, not the scalpel, but the way she carried both, and in doing so, carried everyone else too.